Okay, boys and girls, we're going to learn a little bit about the Cold War in Latin America in the 50s through about the 1980s. And I just got some weird pop-up here. Okay, it looks like we're fine. But anyway, so you can open up your own PowerPoint on the page, or you can just follow along here, either way. So let's get started. So in Latin America during this time, we see like the rise of socialist governments in parts of Asia, like in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in North Korea, and then parts of Africa during decolonization as well, Angola, Congo, and a few others. Same thing happens in Latin America, and a lot of it is a reaction against economic imperialism, and also against a reaction against just the conservative forces that had oppressed, really, peasants there for so long. So it is really a story of socialist groups either coming to power or attempting to, and conservative forces, sometimes in some places backed by the Catholic Church as well, like in Argentina, opposing them and sometimes violently. So some commonalities that we see in the 70s is that there was a lot of political violence in some of these places. Democratic governments sometimes were overturned by the military. That was the case in Chile and a few other places. The idea that the Cuban Communist government had actually survived the United States attempts to overthrow it at the Bay of Pigs invasion and some other assassination attempts of Fidel Castro actually encouraged some of these revolutions. And there was definitely a substantial amount of United States government involvement and support for their allies in Latin America. And when I say their allies, these were usually those opposed to socialism. So they weren't necessarily, democratic, human rights observing governments, but most importantly, they were opposed to socialism, which was the greatest threat, is what the United States saw. And this is again in the context of containment, right, in the Cold War. So Brazil sees a military coup in the 1960s after the presidency of Getúlio Vargas in the 1950s. The army overthrew the president, suspends the constitution, outlaws all political parties, exiled any kind of opposition, and death squads actually killed a lot of civilians and those opposed to this new regime. I don't remember what import substitution industrialization was. I believe it was, So import substitution has to do with Brazil developing its own homegrown industries, because remember, historically, they were an export economy, especially of raw materials, of natural resources, agricultural products especially. And now the government focuses much more on this policy of import substitution industrialization. In other words, they're going to industrialize in order to provide for these imports that they would have otherwise gotten. But we're going to look at other countries as case studies, not so much Brazil here. First, Chile, really important country because there was some pretty strong American involvement here. This man was elected democratically, although it was kind of a close election, as president. He's kind of a socialist. You guys remember his name? I'll give you a second. That's right, Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende. He's elected president in 1970, but he's a socialist, and I say but because there are a lot of people that are going to oppose that. So he implements some socialist reforms to redistribute land, for example, from the wealthy to peasants, and this does not look, very appealing to the wealthy who own the land, landowners, conservative elite, and foreign investments as well. And of course, the United States, President of the United States at the time was Richard Nixon. He also nationalizes. Remember what that means? To expropriate, to take over, where the government actually takes over an industry, take over heavy industry and mining. Chile exports a lot of copper, I believe, and some other metals, important metals. So they even expropriated some American-owned copper mines. This is very alarming to the American government as well. And so he's definitely opposed by Richard Nixon, and President Nixon's Secretary of State, perhaps the most influential Secretary of State of the 20th century, Henry Kissinger, orchestrates a plan to try to remove this man from power. And this is a photograph of Allende giving a speech, a pretty popular president, although he was only elected with about a 35% margin. And the United States CIA actually helps to create a climate in the country that gives the military a reason to overthrow Salvador Allende. And they tried to basically like undermine the Chilean economy on purpose in order to create some chaos and give the military, justification for overthrowing this guy, for leading a coup d'etat. And the coup d'etat was led by this guy with the glasses down there, who was an army general named Augusto Pinochet. Augusto Pinochet, and supported by the United States. Salvador Allende, in this military coup, was actually killed in the presidential palace. Thousands of people died in this, but once Pinochet came to power, a lot of Allende's supporters were executed in mass, and a lot of them were rounded up in soccer stadiums in the country and just shot dead right there and buried in mass graves. So he ruled basically like a dictator, undid any of these socialist reforms that Allende tried to implement, and encouraged foreign investment. This is Allende. I think this is before the coup, though. Well, more photographs of the coup and the Catholic Church here. You can see Pope John Paul II sometime in the 1980s, it looks like, with a photograph of Pinochet, with Pinochet. He ruled for a little under 2 decades. He was eventually captured and tried by the International Court, I believe, at The Hague, if I'm not mistaken, but I might be. So look it up. Argentina was saw some sad events happen in the 1970s and 80s. Namely the Dirty War. So in 1974, the president of Argentina is a woman, Isabel Martinez Perón. She was, I think, the second wife of the president, former president Juan Perón. Isabel Perón was overthrown by the military in a military coup. They seized power and suspended the Constitution. The United States government was aware of this as well. There are actually some declassified documents, and you can check them out on the class site as well, and see how the CIA and the executive branch of the government saw the events that were happening in Argentina. And it led to what's called the Dirty War, and it was just a campaign by the government, and again, this was like a conservative government opposing socialism, to basically eliminate the socialist elements from society. And a lot of them were young people. They were college students, college-age people who, again, when they're looking at the plight of peasants, they're thinking, well, capitalism is evil, and it's causing this big gap between rich and poor, and we should implement, socialist-style reforms, equality. But to the conservative groups in society at the time, the landowners, the elite, the privileged, this would probably mean, expropriating mines and redistributing land, and this is no good, right? That would threaten their livelihood. And so this Dirty War campaign was a campaign to crush the socialist opposition that led to a 7-year kind of a civil war between the military and what it called terrorists. And who are these terrorists? They're basically socialist activists. A lot of them were young men, again, and young women as well. About 9,000 Argentinians died, and many thousands went missing. And when I say missing, that's kind of like the catchphrase for the Dirty War, these disappearances, as they were called. The government disappeared something like 9,000 to 10,000 young people, and this is a photograph, an image of some of these people that have never been found before, and these are just, active members of society. So they're family members, obviously, like for years, have been looking for them. And the most famous group to protest against that were these mothers of these young college kids who were disappeared by the government, and they met every day, I think, or they met regularly in the center of Buenos Aires, which is the capital of Argentina, in the main plaza called Plaza de Mayo. So these are the Madres de Plaza de Mayo. They met for years and years of just wearing a white kerchief on their head and holding pictures of their sons and demanding to know where they are. They're most likely dead, but they at least want to know what happened to these people. Where were they buried? The conservative government, the military government, was eventually voted out of power after in 1983, But these women have continued to meet for the last 30 years. They're still meeting in the Plaza de Mayo, and they're asking, where are they? The truth is hidden. Okay, is that all I have there? In Argentina, well, I think I have it in the next note, in a few slides later. There's some more information about Argentina, but let's move to Central America and Nicaragua. In 1979, the dictator Anastasio Somoza is overthrown by a socialist group. The socialist group is the FSLN. I don't have it looked up right now, but it's in Spanish. It's probably means like the Front of Socialists. I don't know what the L would stand for. The N, Nicaragua, and for short, they go by Sandinistas. The Sandinistas are a socialist group in Nicaragua that took power after overthrowing Somoza, and they received political and financial support from communist Cuba. You see that mural there with Castro and the president of Nicaragua under the Sandinistas. And they implemented a command economy. Command economy is where, it's centrally planned, it's government controlled, it's nationalizing property owned by, in this case, elites there in the United States, in order to implement a communist, socialist style government. Of course, U.S. businesses there and the U.S. government is going to not like that so much, and the U.S. government is actually going to directly oppose it. How are they going to oppose the Sandinistas? Through the Contras, which literally means against, and we'll come back to the Contras in a little bit. Actually, I'll explain it here. So the president of the United States when the Sandinistas came to power was Jimmy Carter, and he believed that the United States should stop U.S. arms to in these proxy wars. He promised Panama even control of the Panama Canal. In 1999, they would get it back, because remember, the Panama Canal was U.S. property going back to when the Americans under Teddy Roosevelt had built it, and even tried but failed to get along with these socialists, the Sandinistas. However, when President Ronald Reagan came to power, he was definitely not a fan of communism, and he worked strongly to oppose and undermine communism all around the world. So he wanted to undo this Sandinista revolution and remove the Sandinistas from power. So the American government actually helped arm and train these counter-revolutionaries, these people that were counter to the Sandinistas, and they're called the Contras, which literally means against. So the Contras were financed both by legal funds and also some illegal funds. So we've got the Sandinistas and the Contras in Nicaragua. So how are the Contras funded by illegal funds from the United States? It has to do with Iran. Yes, Iran, the Islamic country all the way on the other side of the world. What in the world do the Contras in Nicaragua have to do with Iran? Some Iranians or some Muslims had taken American and Israelis hostage at an embassy in Lebanon, and in return for the release of those hostages, the Reagan administration agreed to sell weapons to Iran. Iran was engaged in a war at the time against Iraq, and so they needed those weapons. So in return for those weapons that they were receiving, they were going to release the hostages. This was a big controversy in the United States because this was illegal. We don't negotiate with terrorists, but this was an arms for hostage deal in Iran. So what does this have to do with Contras? Well, the money that was made off of the sale of arms to Iran, because you make a profit by selling weapons, that money was funneled into the Contras. So the Contras received that funding as, in order to fight the Sandinistas, and either some of the Contras in the Nicaraguan jungle there. So the U.S. sold arms to Iran, and they did it through Israel as an intermediary, so the U.S. wasn't directly involved, or at least they couldn't trace it, but they eventually did. In exchange for the release of those American and Israeli hostages in Lebanon, and those profits were funneled to the Contras. The Contras were unable to defeat the Sandinistas. However, in free and open elections in 1990, the Sandinistas lost control of the government, and the election went to this lady named Violeta Chamorro. Okay, El Salvador, and we're almost done. The FMLN, look at that flag, looks kind of communist, doesn't it? The FMLN is the socialist group in El Salvador, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. Oh, okay. So I don't know why it's in Spanish and English. Inspired by the Sandinistas next door in Nicaragua, they organized an effective guerrilla force to overthrow the government. So In El Salvador, the communists never came to power, but it was this bloody civil war that raged for a long time, and you can see the very graphic picture in the bottom there. There were a whole lot more graphic ones that I chose to not put in here, but it was an ugly, bloody civil war. The U.S. responded by giving millions of dollars to the Salvadoran army, but the Salvadoran army was also engaged in a lot of atrocities where they had actually killed some Catholic clergy who spoke out against the brutality used by the Salvadoran armies. The U.S. actually pulled some of their funding for that. So many civilians were killed in the Civil War. The FMLN eventually negotiated an end to the war after the USSR fell in 1991, and the Sandinistas lost power in 1990, right next door, right? So what are the themes here? You see military dictatorships in Argentina, in Brazil, and in Chile. Fell apart due to high number of non-combatant deaths and government corruption. So in the long run, all of those governments eventually lost favor with the people, and it usually happened in the late 80s, early 90s, and it's only been since then that most Latin American countries have had, free, open, democratic elections since about the late 80s, early 90s. Argentina, there was military rule that collapsed after they tried to take these islands right off their coast that belonged to Great Britain, and the British went to war with Argentina. Prime Minister at the time was Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. Maybe she knew the Man of Steel, Joseph Stalin. I don't know. In Chile, there was a whole lot of economic growth, and Chile probably has the highest standard of living of any Latin American country today. But they still resented this violence and corruption of the military rule under Pinochet, and they elected a civilian president in 1989. Same thing with Brazil, a civilian president in 1989. So the Brazilian economy was based on they were importing a lot of oil, and for them they had to actually borrow a lot of money. It's really interesting because today a lot of oil has been discovered in Brazil and off the coast of Brazil, and they're starting to become a major oil exporter. But that has only happened in the last 5 years or so. So they were major importers for a long time, and notice the theme there that they had to borrow. Oil exporters in Latin America traditionally have always been Mexico and Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the members of OPEC. OPEC is a very important group, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's mainly Middle Eastern countries, some African countries, and Venezuela. So they made money at first, but also borrowed money in order to increase production and further develop their country. When prices fell, the price of oil fell in the 1980s. They couldn't repay their debts because they're not making as much money off of oil, and then they go into debt. So a lot of Latin America was into debt, $400 billion in all. What was U.S. involvement? What were some other places where the United States were involved besides Chile and besides Nicaragua and these places? Directly involved, like actual military involvement. President Reagan authorized an invasion of Grenada in 1983, so it's a little island nation in the Atlantic, because a Castro, a pro-Castro government was elected, so we basically went in there and removed him from power. But drugs were a really big problem. Hard drugs were a problem in the United States in the 1980s. If you go to Times Square today, it's a big tourist attraction. If you went to Times Square in the early 80s, it was just a den of crackheads and prostitutes. Drugs were a really big problem in the United States, and so part of this war on drugs saw President George H.W. Bush send a military force to the country of Panama and arrest their president, Manuel Noriega. Like, we actually sent our military into a country, captured a president of another country. Why? Because he was a drug dealer, basically. Smuggling drugs and also attacks on U.S. personnel. And what you see there is him with a mugshot in a federal prison or whatever, wherever he's getting booked in Miami, Florida. That's pretty embarrassing. Okay, so Latin America after the fall of the Soviet Union, because socialism and communism no longer seems very appealing, and they're not getting much moral and even financial support from the Soviet Union. The United States actually, some people in the United States actually tried to help right the economies of these Latin American countries that have been just in turmoil for over 100 years. Ever since independence, really, they've just seen like the negative effects of like an economic imperialism, an unfavorable balance of trade that they've had over the years, mainly exporting their raw materials and all that. And so the policies that were implemented in some countries, and I think in Chile, I forget, it's called neoliberalism. Neoliberal economics is like a very pure capitalism, laissez-faire, free market policies, and it was propagated by a famous Nobel Prize-winning economist from the University of Chicago. By the way, the University of Chicago has the most number of Nobel Prize laureates of any school in the world. His name is Milton Friedman, a very influential economist. Like socialists or even Democrats in the United States would probably not be a big fan of Milton Friedman because they believe that there should be more government control and regulation and oversight of the economy. Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, as it was called, believed more in this neoliberalism. So neoliberalism actually, in some places it might work. The United States, for a time, our massive economic growth was basically based on that, like unrestrained, free reign economics. For some reason, it didn't work in Latin America, and it actually caused inflation in a lot of these countries. So it did not work. Any questions? Okay, you can ask me tomorrow. Thank you.